Hello world, welcome to another episode of Outside the Valley. Before we start this week's episode, I just want to say I hope all of you are staying safe out there, staying away from the COVID-19 pandemic, keep your social distancing, and if you are out there protesting, again, stay safe. This week's episode is a replay of our recent webinar, Recruiting and Remote Work in a Post-COVID World. We invite remote work thought leaders to talk about how the recruiting landscape will shift in the post-COVID world, how remote work will play a huge role in employer branding, building the infrastructure for your remote team, and more. This webinar will be hosted by our VP of Sales, Mike Fossey. So you will hear Fossey hosting the podcast, so to speak, and he will introduce our speakers. So without further ado, here we go.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Just to start off, we have about an hour here. So first things first, let's go ahead and introduce our panelists today. First, we have Laurel Farrow. She's the CEO and founder of Distribute Consulting. Laurel is a global thought leader in remote work. She starts, strengthens, and leverages virtual workforces to solve corporate and socioeconomic concerns. She's also a regular contributor to Forbes, writing about all aspects of remote work. Next, we have Matthew Caldwell. He's the CEO and founder at Rocket Power. Matthew is a strategic people ops leader with over 20 years of experience. Before founding Rocket Power, he's VP of people at Instacart and also the director of talent acquisition at Mozilla. His core belief is people power business, right? And this has kind of driven him to empower the most efficient, effective, and professional talent ops team in the industry. And last but not least, we have Greg Russell, who is head of talent at SnapDocs. Greg's the strategic talent leader as well. He's been helping fast-growing tech companies hire for over 20 years. As head of people and talent at SnapDocs, he's helped the company scale 5x in the last 2 years. So those are our panelists for today, and you might wonder who I am. My name is Mike Fossey. I'm the VP of Sales here at Arc.dev. Arc is a remote developer hiring platform, so we make it easy for fast-growing companies to hire great developers who just happen to live outside of your typical zip codes. So jumping in, getting started with the first question. Actually, before we do that, I just want to encourage everybody, we did allot some time at the end for a general Q&A, but if any questions come up during the conversation, definitely feel free to just post that in the chat. I'll try and do my best to address those as they come along. Any that I miss, we'll definitely address at the end. But general question for all the panelists to kick things off. Let's talk about the current market we're in right now. So we've seen a lot of mass layoffs and, a lot of bad news, but do you think the impacts are different to certain skill sets more than others? Like example, design, marketing, engineering, that, and then how can recruiting teams adapt to these shifts in the talent market?
The one industry that's been hit the worst is recruiting. I think the most recent stats I heard is there's 40% unemployment in recruiting. And I think that's because, yes, a lot of other things are getting hit. Engineering, I don't really think engineering and design are getting laid off. I think they're probably just not hiring as fast. I think marketing is going through a very interesting time right now because consumer behavior is changing with COVID, and it's maybe a temporary change, it's maybe a long-term change. We don't know about that. But I do think that for sure companies are pausing their hiring, and that definitely impacts HR and recruiting. Sometimes HR is in more demand during those times. But definitely recruiting is not in demand as much right now because there's just not the volume of hiring being made.
I agree. And from our perspective in the remote work industry, obviously it's a high time for us in our industry. However, what we're seeing is that it is less to do with industry and more to do with flexibility of the company. Are they willing to adapt? Are they willing to update and upskill? And if so, they're able to float and enjoy business continuity in a better and more resilient way than their competitors, even within the same industry. So that resiliency and business continuity is having to do a lot with culture than industry.
Mm-hmm. So Laura, the next question is for you. What do you think the new channels organizations can leverage to source talent are? Like, especially, when it comes to remote work, like what kind of channels are the options that you're looking at here?
Well, just about any channel is going to have people that are looking for remote jobs, period. About 86% of the United States workforce wants a remote job, and that has only increased in the past 3 months. So you can really feel confident in using your existing channels and accessing good virtual talent. What needs to be updated instead of the channels is the funnel. You really need to focus on your talent acquisition funnel, because what can happen is if once you label a job as remote friendly, the average increase in application rate is 3,000%. And that is a massive, massive problem for your TA team if they're not prepared for that level of volume. So it really becomes a new conversation about quantity versus quality, and how to balance and how to screen for skills and technical ability that is uniquely beneficial to remote work. So instead of focusing on channels for updating, I would focus on the back end instead.
I completely agree with that. I think it's, remote is very channel agnostic, I think, and the rest of that is all true as well. I think, we've seen a huge increase in inbound applications recently, but I think that's really more a product of layoffs and folks being out of work at the moment, right? We haven't necessarily kind of, advertised that we're much more open to remote, although we are obviously right now, and we will be going forward. But we've seen, I've got a recruiter who's got a data scientist role on right now, and she's had 1,000 applicants in something like 2 weeks. It's just insane. And then I think Laurel makes another good point, right? I think just about kind of what are the criteria that you're evaluating, right? If something is going to be remote, what are those skills and attributes and capabilities that are going to set somebody up to better work in that type of environment than, rather than being in the office all the time.
So remote work, it's clearly becoming more mainstream, right? But how does the shift impact, employer brand, right? So not necessarily, what the company does, but why it's a good opportunity to work here, their interview process, the experience. What do you think is the impact overall there?
Yeah, so one of the things that was interesting, when I worked at Mozilla, we were very, very distributed. We had offices, but we had people sitting in their houses all over the world. And that one of the things I realized when we were working there is that actually was a competitive advantage. We could compete against the Googles, the Facebooks, the Amazons. These are the big companies that require people to be in the offices, because you could sit in Kansas, you could sit in your house in Denmark, you could sit anywhere and do the work. And so that was a competitive advantage for the few companies like Mozilla or Envision or GitLab up until now. I think what we're seeing right now is a huge shift in the reality that companies realize that because they've been forced to actually work remote, companies that might have been hesitant to it in the past are realizing it's possible. I was talking with a head of HR for a semiconductor company, and because they have, they manufacture wafers in labs, they always thought that everybody had to work in person. And now 93% of the employees are working remote because they have to. So there's gonna be a shift in that once every company or majority of companies out there allow for remote work, you can't just rely on, hey, we're remote friendly or you can work remote. You have to start focusing on the really key important things, which are the culture, the vision of the company, the core values of the company, what it stands for, the product that it's making, where the product's going, maybe the uniqueness of the people that are there. If you're an early stage company, you've got some halo employees that might have had successful exits at some point or another. There's going to be things you're going to have to focus on that are not necessarily about remote anymore, because everybody's doing it at this point. So I think it's going to really require a mind shift for a lot of companies to really think about how they brand themselves. They definitely have to be open to remote. I shouldn't say they have to be, but you're going to be putting yourself in a good position if you are open to remote. And then that's just almost like table stakes now. Now it's what else is there that you can provide as value to an employee along their journey in their next role.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. And I think the important thing is, I'm not sure that being more remote or more kind of remote centric necessarily means that you change the culture. But I think, to Matt's point, it means that you really need to articulate the culture. You need to articulate everything, right? Just so much better, more clearly, and more probably, right? Just more communication. When you have much more, of your workforce remote rather than being in the office where they're just kind of soaking all that stuff up by osmosis sometimes, right? Like,
Yeah.
To be really, I think, a lot more deliberate about how you communicate and getting that message out more often, probably, on some of the cultural stuff.
I completely agree. I think it's just critical for every employer to understand that what is happening right now in this, 2 to 3 month reaction to suddenly implementing shelter in place, work from home contingency plans. It's not remote work. You are allowing people to work in a different workplace, but truly optimizing virtual collaboration and integrating that into your operational workflow are very, very different things. And so this is just, changing the workplace. It's not remote work. You really need to come into this with intention, with foresight, with proactivity, and make this the change management process very intentional so that you can make this sustainably, because anybody can go remote for 6 weeks to 3 months. Like that's easy to do. Children can do it, honestly. However, maintaining that and making it sustainable is a different conversation. I mean, we have the classic cases of IBM and Yahoo that retracted their policies after about a year of remote work. And even they, in the beginning, were saying, oh, this is easy. This is great. Look at all these benefits that are happening. It's the sustainability that's different. And so, yeah, really integrating those changes like we were talking about with the talent acquisition funnel. Are you willing to really update the infrastructure of your company and upskill your workforce in order to match this new style of work? That's what's going to make or break the success of a company.
Oh, that's a good point. I think that's the last sentence there that you mentioned is definitely key, right? I think it has to come down to kind of commitment and change in the general culture overall, and that will eventually, lead out to things like talent brand and all that. So excellent, good points. Thanks, everyone. Greg, next question. I'd like you to kick off here. I know you have some skills in this, but what are some tips for creating job descriptions that help get the right candidates? Especially ones that really help attract the right cultural fit for your organization.
Yeah, I do. You may know, Fossey, I've got some strong opinions about job descriptions. So probably my strongest opinion, and I know this is not something everybody shares, but I really separate. There's a job description and then there's a job ad, right? And so the job description is an internal document that we use to describe every little thing we can possibly think of about the role or the person we want. And the job ad is just that. It's an ad, right? And that's where we really, we try and get creative. We try and tell the story of SnapDocs. And we try and really get some of the culture to kind of come across in that document, right? And I think, to be perfectly honest, I mean, this is, giving away one of my trade secrets, I guess, but, I think just that little difference, right? That instead of, we've never, I won't allow us to just post a bunch of bullet points as a job ad, right? I think that alone helps kind of get some of the culture across, right? And it helps really attract folks. It's probably the second, well, it is the second most common comment that we get from candidates is, some variation of, wow, who wrote that job ad? That was awesome. It really gave me some sense of what SnapDocs would be like. And it made me really want to talk to you guys, right? And find out, what it's really like there. So I think for me, that's really key. It's storytelling, right? Recruiting is storytelling. You got to tell the story to the candidate of the company, of the opportunity, right, of the growth, of all these different things, of the culture, right? And sometimes you need to tell that candidate, the recruiter needs to be able to tell that candidate story internally to leadership or management or whatever. So recruiting is all about storytelling. And so I think it starts right from the beginning when you first put that, that ad up and you're trying to attract people. What's the story? Take a little bit of time to craft some kind of story, even if you're doing it in bullet points, right?
That's an excellent point. And, I being in sales, right, I'm a big fan of storytelling. Just pretty much a lot of similarities with sales and recruiting. So we definitely incorporate storytelling and understanding the impact and everything. Laurel, Matt, do you have anything to add to Greg's point here?
I think for me, I really saw the power of that when it comes to attracting the right culture. When I was at Mozilla, we did a lot of studies internally about people that were good performers over time and what were some of the commonalities amongst a lot of those employees. And one of the things we found is a large percentage of the high performers who stayed for a long time, had career progression, they also spent a lot of time outside of their work doing some sort of volunteer work. They volunteer for political action campaigns, for food banks, for you name it, churches, whatever. They just did something where they were giving their time for free to other people. And we also kind of had this little edge of like fighting the man, like we were fighting the Googles of the world, we were fighting the whole, control over the internet. And so there was a couple aspects of our personality in the organization that we could highlight in job descriptions, talking about whether or not you really want to do the right thing for humanity, whether or not you're driven by trying to empower the world as a whole, talking about trying to fight against bigger institutions to do what is right and hard. And we were able to incorporate a lot of that into the job descriptions, which to Greg's point, highlighted what it's like to be inside. And it did a couple things. I think it attracted the right people, and I think it also filtered out the people we probably didn't necessarily want. And so a job ad is meant, like you said, it's about sales, but it's also about kind of opening up the window a little bit into what it's like to be an employee at this company.
Mm-hmm.
I love that we're having this conversation about the importance of the hard conversation, right? The tactical conversation, as well as the emotional based, making that connection and that human to human connection that culture is all about, that recruiting is all about, that storytelling, that emotional connection to the company, because that's foreshadowing of the importance of remote work skills. More than ever before in history, we are seeing a necessity based on self-management of the worker. And what that requires is a much higher level of emotional intelligence in the worker. They need to have better communication skills. They need to have more intrinsic motivation and proactivity. They need to have more empathy in their communication. Just more than ever, we're seeing this resurgence of soft skills. And so I think it's critical to foreshadow that in the recruiting, and right from that job ad from day one, saying this is a priority in our company, this is a priority in our culture, this is a priority in our operations. So screening and filtering candidates right from day one based on that emotional intelligence is critical.
Oh yeah, that's definitely great points all around. Appreciate it. I wanted to actually switch gears here. We have a question from the audience. So question here is, how do you see distributed or remote companies solving the isolation problem that remote employees can feel, especially those that are very disconnected? They might just be themselves out middle of America or a different country or something, but sometimes with time zone differences and things like that, right? How do you kind of address that? Whether it's now currently when you've just shifted to having to work with remote, or whether you're building this into your strategy. Curious to hear everyone's thoughts as to how you build a culture around that piece.
I actually can talk about this a little bit later, but this is something that again, back to Mozilla, I really started to appreciate that at Mozilla. We were very early users of Zoom at all things, and because we were so distributed and we had people all over the place and working out of their house, I learned there that it happened organically, but then it became intentional. And that you think about I think it was Greg earlier said, all the stuff that happens organically in an office, when you're at the water cooler, or when you're sitting in the cafeteria, or when you're taking a walk to the coffee shop down the street with a few of your employees. That is all culture stuff. That's all culture. That's connections. That's feeling like you're part of a tribe. And it just doesn't happen organically the same way when you're remote and we're all sitting in our houses. So the company has to be very intentional. And that means a lot more intentional, structured conversations. For us, Rocket Power, we are a remote first company. We have been that way from the beginning. We have structured meetings every day of the week with different people and in different formats. A couple of them are just short stand-ups. And then we have, our teams will break off into different groups, and there's different types of interaction with the various different leaders, and also team members together that don't have any leaders. We do happy hours, virtual happy hours. There's a lot of that stuff that has to happen, but then I think really it's important when you can, obviously right now it's hard, but when you can, to also get people together in person on a regular basis. Mozilla did a great job of flying people in from around the world. They were doing it like every 6 weeks. I don't know if that's feasible for a lot of companies, but having at least once a quarter, maybe twice a year, everybody together, and having them together for actual working sessions, not just to hang out and party and go golfing or hang out at the beach or drink, but to actually work, do some things, work together, understand what it's like to work together, and then also have all the social activities as well. That will create connections that when you're now separated, it's a lot easier to feel like, hey, I know this person. And when I'm on the Zoom with them or I'm on the hop in or whatever I'm doing, I have that connection with them that I wouldn't have had otherwise. So I think there's a lot to this, but those are just a couple of quick things that I can think
of. Yeah. I just real quick, I'll add my 2 cents on. I'd love to hear Laurel on this because I think this is your area, right? But for us, it's been really interesting because we were not a remote first company at all, really. Before the pandemic, we were, our philosophy was very much, everybody's an adult and you got to work from home. Sometimes you got to wait for the cable guy, or you just got to be more productive, work from home. Great. Like it wasn't, there wasn't a lot of questions or whatever, but at the same time, the default was the expectation is everybody's in one of our offices, for the most part. And so, so this is, we obviously had to kind of rapidly shift away from that. And it's been, it's been a lot of work, right? Like for the people team, I mean, we have put in a lot of work to try and kind of create that virtual structure, right? That virtual infrastructure of, like Matt was saying, everything from, the silly, right? Like the afternoon fun poll to the happy hour, the virtual lunch, like, to more kind of serious, like communications and get-togethers, right? That are centered around work or company communications, right? That's a ton of work, right? And I can see, coming out of this, our stance, I am not quite sure what our stance will be, but I know that it will not be what it was before we went in, right? We're not going to expect everybody back in the office all the time. We're probably going to be a lot more open to remote and have folks that are kind of a day or two in the office kind of thing. And so, we've kind of had to put some of this in place just to make sure that people are connected during this time. But, we need to really think about, okay, what of this do we keep? What becomes kind of, infrastructure for more remote.
Right. Yeah, no, that's excellent.
Yeah, so this is a very common question, right? Everybody's worried. Are we raising an entire generation of hermits? And it's a valid question. It's a valid concern. However, I think it's really important to start with the fact that there are 2 parts to isolation. One is social, and that's typically the one that we think of. But the more important one that influences more remote worker isolation than social is informational isolation. In an office, people represent a resource, so that you have someone to ask if you have a question. They are the ones that are facilitating promotions and opportunities and introductions. They're a resource in your job. And so when you are disconnected from the people, you are more disconnected from the opportunities that people provide than you are the actual people. So you don't necessarily miss sitting next to somebody, you miss being able to ask somebody a question when it pops into your mind. So that's a really important factor of the change management process, is you need to focus more heavily on infrastructure. How are you going to keep people connected so that the information stays unified, that the information within the company continues to flow? So that informational infrastructure is absolutely essential. However, I mean, elephant in the room, of course, social isolation is also a concern. We're alone all day, and that's hard for a lot of people. However, the common mistake that most employers make is when they say, well, we need to be back in the same place so that our culture can exist. And that's where I remind employers that connection has nothing to do with proximity. It is absolutely common and plausible to be sitting 5 feet away from somebody else and feel completely isolated. So that's where culture, again, it comes back to culture, and we're saying, how are you truly connecting your people? How are you making sure that individuals feel uniquely recognized and valued and connected to the mission and vision of your company? That is true culture. And if you have that culture that is not based on, cereal bars in the break room and ping pong tables in the lobby, like when you have true culture that is more the personality of your company, that is much easier to virtualize. And then it just becomes a matter of changing the channel. So we're not going to celebrate your accomplishments in the break room. We're going to celebrate your accomplishments in a virtual event. And we're going to get together in Zoom and all talk about what a great accomplishment this was for you and for the team.
Yeah, no, that's actually, I almost look at it as kind of like one of the things you mentioned is you can be 5 feet away from somebody and still be completely isolated. I think you saw a big shift in the early 2000s where people started to move away from cubicles and do like the open desk concept to kind of solve for that. And I think kind of remote is somewhat of the next step in that. And we've all kind of had to figure out a way of, how do we build this next area of collaboration, whether we're, sitting right there or, we're hundreds of miles away. So excellent points there. We have another question, actually 3. Wow, active audience today. Great. So the next question here, and this kind of actually ties into what we were just talking about. So how do you ensure that you maintain the motivation of the staff who maybe are required to be physically in the office while the majority of the employees are working from home? So I guess you kind of look at this a couple different ways. Like maybe there are some people that still need to maintain the office to maintain something like a server or something like that, right? They have to be there no matter what. It's essential. But that can be somewhat isolating in itself or demotivating when they're kind of sitting there in an empty office that used to be full of employees. But yeah, the question here is, how do you ensure that motivation of the staff who have to stay there and everybody else is working from home and things like that? Any thoughts on that?
I'll start. I don't want to talk too much, but I'll give Matthew and Greg a chance to compile their thoughts. So hybrid teams are incredibly difficult for exactly this reason. GitLab calls it, or I'm sorry, GitHub calls it the pants versus coffee debate, right? That the people in the office are saying, oh, you don't have to wear pants. And the people that are out of the office are saying, oh, you get a barista on call all the time. And so the grass is always greener on the other side. The dynamics are inevitably going to be difficult and to be tricky. So in that circumstance, I would really focus on the priority and the ultimate objective of remote work, which is not to say that working from home or co-working space is better than working from the office. That's the default that most people go to. However, that's completely hypocritical because we're still saying that our productivity is based on a location. And that's like American politics, right? It's like, I'm right. No, I'm right. And it's like, you're both saying the same thing. You're both saying that you need to be in a specific spot to be productive. So the real goal here is that we want our productivity to be location irrelevant, that it is completely independent of your location, and therefore you get to choose the location that is best for you and for your tasks. And so it's much more of an employee empowerment conversation that they get to say, I want to be in the office, I need to be in the office because it's better for my job. And somebody else can say, I need to be in the office today, but I need to be at home tomorrow, and then I need to be at the client's office on Friday because that's what's going to be the best location for each of the tasks that I need to do on those days. And so it's really leveraging and capitalizing on location as a resource as opposed to making trapping somebody in a specific location for a specific reason.
Excellent points. Greg or Matt, anything?
Go ahead, Greg. Sorry.
I'm not sure I have much to add there. I mean, I think, for us, it's going to, because I think, Flossie, part of your question was like, for the folks who just must be there because their job just requires it in some way, right? Like, I think Laurel's making a great point. I think for most people, and if all the roles in the company are such that you can do this, right, that everybody's got that extreme flexibility and choice to work wherever they want to work, right, and wherever they feel like they can be most productive, whether that's in an office or in their home or on a beach in Costa Rica, right? Like, that's amazing. I think the reality for some companies is that there will be some functions that just need to be in some physical location. That's not, we're going to be more like the ideal that Laurel described. There may be a team or two that we'll have in the office a bit more going forward. But yeah, I think it's, and going back to Laurel's example, I mean, for instance, like, I cannot wait to go back to the office. And I think, and this is interesting too, right? I think what's been interesting about the shelter in place, the pandemic, is, you've got, and I saw this kind of fairly early on, this started to reveal itself, right? And I lived it, is, you've got people who are like, oh my God, work from home is amazing. I got no commute now. And I got all this time and I'm pickling stuff and I'm like, growing things. And I am like getting back to the land and stuff in all my free time, right? I'm binge watching. I just finished Netflix, And then you've got parents, right, who are going, oh my God, this is terrible. I've got even less time than I had before. How is this possible, right? And so, for some of us, it's like that. I dream about the office. It's like this oasis, right, of calm, productivity. So I think, I think there's going to be a lot of different angles that people will come at this from, and yeah. So I'm not even sure I answered the question there, but those are some thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, that was an interesting question I hadn't thought about, and I like Laurel's answer because she's clearly thought about it more than I have. Also, I also think that there's, I think of a couple friends of mine who have jobs where they work there, they have to go to server rooms, they have to do certain things, and I know that there's times where they've made little comments to me. Well, it must be nice that you don't have to go to the office. We're gonna have to navigate through some of this because there are. I mean, Instacart, the where I used to work, those shoppers can't work from home. They gotta do that work. The only way they can work is by going out and driving around and going to different people's houses and stores. Some of our other clients, they have certain types of jobs, kind of to Laurel's point, that require location. And it's going to be an interesting dynamic, this hybrid model, pants versus coffee. I've never heard that before, and I like it. It's going to. This is a very, I think, an important question because we're going to face more of it in the future. There's just going to be certain jobs that have to be done in person. I got another friend who does work for Chevron, and they throw him on planes to fly to Dubai to work on. He's got to go and do some crazy exotic welding for things. Welding can't really be done virtually right now. They're actually, Chevron's doing some pretty cool stuff around that. But there's certain things that are just going to require people to be in places at times, and we're going to have to figure out how to, as Laurel said, empower them, make them feel appreciated, make them understand the value of what they're doing for the company and for the culture of the company. And yeah, I think I'm just babbling because it's just I'm thinking out loud here. But great question.
No, those are all excellent points, right? I think that it's easy for someone like myself who's in sales, let's move the team remote, no problem, right? But you bring up a lot of different roles out there, and it becomes much more challenging. Even if we stay in tech, right? You mentioned welding and things, but if we're staying in the tech industry, there are people that have to manage servers and be there physically. There is infrastructure for a lot of these larger size companies that needs to be maintained. A lot of it comes down to security and stuff. So I think even if 90 to 95% of the team moves remote, it's still important to make sure that those people that in office are still feeling recognized and appreciated, to everyone's point there. So excellent points. Got another question from the audience here. Very active today. So this is a good one. I like this. So teams that were co-located before this time, right? I'm guessing this time means COVID, right? So they've already established ways of work, and they likely feel connections, right, with their employees. So how are new teams, or even new hires, or cross-functional teams, or new initiatives being brought together? In what ways are firms addressing the connections to bring productivity? It's a long question, so let me know if you need me to repeat that. But,
I'll jump in. I think this goes back to something maybe it was Laurel said earlier, right, about the importance of culture. So I think I get the point of the question, right? I think about SnapDocs. We're 155 today. We were 110 before the shelter in place started. So we have done quite a bit of hiring fully remotely, right? So we've got almost a third of the company is brand new and has only ever been remote only. And so yeah, I would have thought that would be a big challenge of incorporating those folks, right? And wow, we've got all these other people had this shared experience, right? And that they can that's the foundation of their experience at SnapDocs, and these new people aren't going to have that. And wow, that's going to be this. It's going to be really hard, this divide, right? I'm going to knock on wood here, but I don't think we've seen that so far, right? And I think that's mostly a function of the fact that we have a really strong culture, and we've taken pains to make sure that we have translated the parts of that culture that were very kind of on-site based, right, office based. We've taken pains to make sure that we translate those things, the things that don't just kind of obviously translate to remote, that we've translated those into more of a remote format. So I think that's a big key, right? That's a big key, bringing any new people into any organization and making sure that they feel welcomed and part of the team, and whether you're sitting on top of each other or whether you're fully remote, right? I think it's that culture and that kind of cultural infrastructure, if you will, right? That foundation. I think it's just so important.
Sure.
Yeah, I would echo that. Times like this reveal weaknesses of culture, and I think Laurel said this, that culture is not about candy bars and ping pong. I mean, if it is, that's a problem. That's a problem anyways. And times like this are going to make it abundantly clear that that's a problem. Culture needs to be about the people, about the motivations, about the intrinsic value that the company has in what it's doing. It has to be about the focus. It has to be people being aligned towards mission and an objective. And then how you go about doing that and how you treat each other and how the community as a company works. And if you've got that in place already and you've got solid culture that really focuses more on the things that have nothing to do with the building that you're sitting in or the place that you happen to be sitting right now to do your work, then back to, I think, again, what Laurel said is that you have to have the infrastructure in place. You got to have the communication channels, the Slack, not just Slack, but lots of different like groups within Slack to allow people to communicate. You have to have the regular, regularly scheduled and structured formal communication where you have Monday meetings and Tuesday stand-ups and Wednesday this breakout team and afternoon breakout team with this team. Like you got to have all of that, and that will ensure productivity stays as long as you've got that culture. And I think we keep going back to culture. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. I mean, if you have a strong culture, it will be able to survive this 3 month period of kind of a little bit of chaos and interruption in the way things are done, and could actually thrive right now to the point where Greg's company's a third the size bigger than it was before, and this is all they know. So I think it does come down to a lot to the culture, and then obviously the mechanical infrastructure behind it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think an easy way to think of this is that you are literally moving workplaces. Every company that is going from physical to virtual, that is what you're doing. And just like if you were moving from one office to another, the process that you would go through is, packing a box. Is you get the pile of papers and file folders and you go through them and you say, which ones do I need? Which ones do I not need? Is this essential in the new office? And you get rid of those that you don't. The ones that are essential, you put in the box and you take it to the new office and you find a space for it. And that's exactly what we're doing as teams right now, is identifying what is essential, what is good to keep, not just what do we have and moving it all to the new office, but what is really essential and critical to our culture and how do we experience that, and keeping that and making sure that there's a space for that in this new virtual workplace, and then getting rid of the everything that we don't. And we can see this in meetings, we can see this in onboarding, we can see this in every single element of our operations. And so those things that are worth preserving and worth keeping, that we really value and are very critical, all we need to do is just shift that into a new channel. So, was that tour of the office really, really fun and exciting during the onboarding phase? Yeah. Then how do you do that? Maybe we can create a virtual tour of our office and give somebody a screen share of the handbook and introduce them to different team members and pop in on meetings and give them introductions or whatever. Like, it's a time of opportunity and innovation if people can expand their mindset to not feeling so stuck and forced into it.
That's a good point. I like that. I think it's a good idea about kind of recreating the experience, right? You're moving workplaces. I like that. Well, cool. So I want to shift gears here, as we've got about 20 minutes left, and kind of take the conversation from culture to actually recruiting, right? So first question directed at Laurel, but everybody feel free to jump in here. What are some of the hard and soft skills recruiters should be screening for when actually looking for remote workers? And how do you design your recruiting process to evaluate those skills?
Yeah. Well, Matthew and Greg have much more boots on the ground experience than I do. So I'll really lean into them to answer this with much more experience. My answer is research based and based on my limited experience as a COO of a fully distributed company. But that is, again, I'll focus more on the emotional intelligence side. So there was a really great academic study conducted by Roberta Swatsky at Okanagan College of Business in Canada. And she and I became great friends because I had this list through my time of screening candidates that I said, I feel like these are really essential soft skills to be looking for. Mm-hmm. And then when I heard about her study a couple of years ago, it turns out it was exactly the same skills. And so we can follow that up in show notes or something, but essentially it's these points of intrinsic motivation and proactivity, communication, empathy, trust. Skills like that are absolutely critical in remote workers because, again, they're self-managers. And so you need to be able to depend on them in a higher level. They need to be able to think critically and problem solve independently. There's just a higher level of awareness and responsibility that is required for remote workers. So it's essential that you be screening for those soft skills. But Matthew and Greg, I turn the floor to you.
I don't have much to add. I mean, I was just thinking about the things that popped into my head. Then Laurel said them basically, right? So communications. I mean, I think being able to communicate well and effectively is got to be number one in my book. EQ, absolutely, the empathy and the EQ, super important. And then the autonomy and the drive, right? Like I think if you're not in the office every day and you're not walking around and seeing your people doing their stuff, right? Like you just have to be confident that they're over there in their house or wherever it is doing their stuff, right? And so just, I think screening extra hard for that autonomy gene, that proactivity is just going to be really important.
Yeah, I think I co-authored a blog post about this with my COO back in early March, ironically, about remote interviewing and interviewing people remotely and some of the challenges that are there and some of the misconceptions about it. A couple things that are interesting is Science Daily did a study on video interviewing particularly, and they talked about the fact that video interviewing, it enables you to actually focus on the right things in interviews. Historically, and I've done it, I know a lot of people have also done this, like when you're a candidate, you walk in to sit in a room and interview with someone, there's a lot of this whole, like I'm trying to connect with them as a person. I'm trying to understand who they are and find a way to like mirror them. And it's all this gut, like non-actual structured stuff that has anything to do with whether you can do the job. It's about whether or not I can figure out a way to make this person like me as a human. Whereas when you're interviewing people who are going to work remote and you are interviewing them remotely, that entire process actually allows you to be much more structured, much less biased, and really focus on the key things. But in order to be successful at focusing on the hard skills and the soft skills, you have to really ahead of time, you have to identify what those are. It has to be structured. Each person that walks in that interview has to know what they're going to be focusing on from a hard skill and a soft skill perspective. They need to know how they're going to ask those questions, what a good answer is and what not a good answer is, how to redirect, how to dig into certain areas. They really have to be able to do that very, very well, especially when you're talking about remote employees and the remote interview process. It has to be a structured process that everybody's very well prepared for, and they have all of the lexicon down, they have all the understanding of what's necessary down, and they're aligned really with what the goal of the interview is to find this person that does this specific job well. And if they do that well and they focus on all those skills the right way, you actually have the data shows that you get better outcomes in those interviews with people that actually can do the job. The soft skills is extremely important, I think, when you talk about specifically people that are going to be remote forever, because they have to be able to communicate. I mean, they both Laurel and Greg have said this. They have to be able to be someone who is proactively going to communicate, because it's not going to just be something where their boss can walk over and tap them on the shoulder and say, hey, what's going on? Or their colleague can see that they look like they're frustrated and say, hey, what's going on? They have to be able to communicate. But that's things you can put in that interview format that allow for you to be able to figure that out.
I would argue that those things that you were saying there, Matt, about kind of having your focus area and really understanding what questions to ask to get at that stuff. I mean, that's just super important for interviewing, even if you're in person, right? Like, yeah, that's just super important. I do agree with you though. Like I think interviewing remotely, there's less false positives for that reason, right? Like you said, sitting in front of somebody and you there's this like active trying to connect, which is important, right? And I think we do that over video as well, but it's just different. And I think it's because you're not in the room and there's a slight barrier there. I think you're right. There's like, it kind of keeps some of the false positives out of it, right? And it's much more about like you're able to better kind of really hear and evaluate what somebody's saying about those specific things that you're asking about, right?
Yeah.
And you just need to see them in their context too. Like if they're going to be working remotely, you need to know what it's like to work with them remotely. Like this is why working interviews are so much more common in remote work, and why virtual interviews need to be, like, not want to be, need to be part of the funnel, because you just need to see, like, is it awkward to have a video call with them? Because you're going to be having a lot of them.
Yeah, 100%.
A quick little tag onto that. My COO that helped co-author that blog with me, one of the things he said is he was early on, he was hiring for Accenture, all these inside salespeople who all they would do all day long is make phone calls. And he realized all we're doing is interviewing these people in person. Like we should put them on the phone and see the context of how they're actually going to do their work and interview them on the phone because that's how they're going to perform. And I think that's an important thing you just brought out, Laurel, is that this is going to be their reality. So how do they act on Zoom? How do they interview when they're in their home? Do they have professional background or not a professional background, a bunch of liquor behind them? Like what is that? What do they represent your company? Are you going to be comfortable having them sit on Zoom in company meetings? I mean, I think that's a good point.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. Those are all great points. So if we're going to open up for questions at the end, we probably got time for one more question. So I'll just ask everybody, the group here. We all know what happened during the pandemic, right? It's still going on, but there's been massive shifts in working from home, regardless of whether this was part of your organization before or not. But it's not really equal to, I would say, normal remote work, right? What do you think some of the new practices or processes are that you think will continue even after this pandemic is over and we go back to the quote unquote normal? Anything that you've maybe said, hey, this is a great way we can do this, or any sort of new processes in place that have actually been helpful that you might want to keep, or you've seen other businesses do? It might necessarily be you, but
yeah, I'll emphatically raise my hand to that and say what we're experiencing right now and what we did experience, especially in March and April, was not remote working. Even the veterans that have been working remotely for over a decade, like myself, we were all connecting with each other and just saying, how is this so hard? Like, we're good at this. We teach other people how to do this, and we're completely overwhelmed. Like, that was not working remotely. That was trying to maintain business continuity during a global emergency. Period. So yes, it will get much, much easier over time as things continue to stabilize and as our companies understand what the next normal is going to be. So in terms of things that I think are going to be continuous, regardless of if we go back to the office or not, we will never go back to that phase of our business world in which the question of remote work was if it's a possibility, if it's a viability. We'll never go back there. Now it's been proven internationally at scale that remote work is possible. So now it's a question about how are we going to collaborate as virtual teams, regardless of if people are in the office or at home? How do we enhance mobility and resiliency in our companies? And so that, I think, is more, but again, not based on workplace and location, but based on the elements that make remote work different and more resilient. And so that's things like asynchronous communication, results-based tracking, and again, not to be repetitive, but emotional intelligence and soft skills. So I think that that's what I hope to see more of in the future.
Yeah. I'm not sure kind of what will carry forward. I agree with everything Laurel was saying there. I think one thing that I've seen is with being remote, I think during this period we've kind of optimized for a lot of meetings in a sense, because I think everybody's kind of yearning for the connection and feeling like they want to get together with their colleagues, and so there's something where maybe normally you'd kind of look at it and go, is that a meeting, or should I just fire off an email or get on Slack with people or whatever? And I think we're kind of leaning towards, let's just meet, right? We want to connect. I think that will hopefully kind of change a bit, because I think in some ways, I think what this has shown is that we don't need to be, physically together. We don't need to be meeting, right? And so I think there probably is a lot more kind of that we can get done asynchronously. But then making sure, okay, so what is the replacement for that kind of face-to-face or that in-person connection, right? And so maybe that's just more social stuff over Zoom or whatever that is. And then the other comment is, this has definitely shown us that, remote interviewing, fully remote virtual interviewing, hiring and onboarding, not a problem. I mean, we flipped over and we've hired, at a much faster pace over the last 2 or 3 months than we were beforehand for various reasons, intrinsic to our business. But we haven't missed a step. I mean, we've hired and onboarded 50-ish people since this thing started, and everything's been, the process has been just as good. Everything's been just as good so far. So that's very important.
Yeah, and I think I agree with what both Greg and Laurel said. And I think one of the things I'll say this a little different is the focus around the recruiting side of it. This is going to be very, very interesting for society in general. People, it's going to open up opportunities for people that never could work for Facebook or Google or Amazon, or you name the cool company that's in one of the tech hubs, because they didn't live in one of the tech hubs.
Mm-hmm.
So it's going to open up opportunities for humans to do cool work that they never had open to them again, or never had open to them before. So I think that's awesome from a candidate perspective. I think from the mechanics of actually doing recruiting, it's going to be interesting. I mean, I'm sure Greg can appreciate this. When we would have a manager say, I don't care where they live, I'll hire them from anywhere. That made recruiting really hard, actually, because the way the mechanics of recruiting was done is I would put in like a zip code, and I would then put in all the requirements for the skills that are necessary and all the other things that we're looking for. And then I'd have a pool of like 1,000 people that I'd try and whittle down to like a couple hundred and then go out and reach out to them. Well, now if they can work anywhere, that pool is now like 100,000. And then how do I think about, I got to call like Johnson, who is helping support this, it's like 1 a.m. his time right now. How do I call that person? Do I stay until 1 a.m. to call that person? How do I actually go out and do this attraction of quality candidates that literally can sit anywhere and then manage that? And so the recruiting, top of the funnel mechanics of how you get great talent, not even just about the branding, but the actual work of doing it is going to have to change. I think it's going to have to focus a lot more on actually branding and become more of a marketing ploy and trying to really attract people to apply, because that will help people apply at 1 a.m. when I'm sleeping, and instead of me having to go out and source somebody at 1 a.m. But then it's also going to require even companies to think about their recruiting and interviewing teams and make sure that they're set up in a way where they can accommodate people that are on opposite sides of the clock, so that they can really enable those people to get into the company. Overall, I think it's going to be a really amazing thing for lots of reasons, but it's going to create some challenges. But I think I've always said challenges are a good thing. They cause you to grow and they cause you to get better. And I think this is going to cause the tech world, the employment world in general, to grow and get better. I think it's going to cause a lot of opportunity for humanity. People can do some cool stuff that they never had options for before.
Yeah, I'll piggyback onto that and say that when we see that pendulum swing, just like we were talking about in the beginning of this event, when people just say, well, we can hire from anywhere, and they just literally open it to anywhere, it's really going to cause massive problems for your talent acquisition funnel. So instead, again, think of location as a resource to be leveraged, and not just say, well, okay, like we'll just default to the United States, but think about, okay, certain states have certain licensure expenses. How can we save costs and cut costs by recruiting in these states instead of these states? Or there are a few universities in specific locations throughout the world that have really strong programs for our industry. Can we target those zip codes? And then combining all of those factors and saying, okay, which candidates have easy access to the airport, because we know that we're going to have on-sites at least once a quarter. Like so many factors like that can help you whittle down and really identify unique and valuable opportunity zones for your company individually. So that's something that we do at Distribute Consulting and have seen immense success with.
And then just one more thing to add on top of all that, right? I think we're going to see a huge shift, because right now, like we were saying, in the everywhere, I mean, the economy's a wreck, right? But the tech world, there's massive layoffs, massive unemployment. We're getting thousands of inbound applicants now, right? As we move to this more remote, more flexible posture. But that won't be the case, forever. In a year, when things kind of are back on track, right? Hopefully sooner, then we're back to needing to go and source every engineer, because you put up an ad and you get 3 responses, right? When we're back to those days, then that's going to be completely different again, right? So that just that difference between sorting through 1,000 resumes from all over the country and then needing to be really targeted about, okay, I'm going to go hunt for some people and I'm going to go hunt in these different locations.
Right. And diversity, the ripple effects of this on diversity cannot be ignored.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's actually, that'll bring us up to our last question, actually. It came up is, how do you mitigate bias in recruiting when you're interviewing for, a particular set of focus on soft skills and things like that, especially when it comes to remote? Any thoughts there?
Lots of thoughts. I don't know if I can even say mine in 2 minutes, but
yeah.
I mean, I think that goes back to you have to have that structured interview. Bias comes in when you don't have a structured interview, when you don't have the entire team agreed upon as to their soft skills are important. Communication skills are important. There's a lot of other soft skills that are going to be important. And you have to make sure that the person that's doing the interview understands what they're interviewing for and understands the questions they need to ask and how to measure the responses. Because if you just let somebody walk into an interview unprepared, then it's just going to be biased. It really just comes down to you are going to, I think I can hang out at the park on Saturday with this person, so that's why I want to hire them. And that's a recipe for all sorts of disaster around bias. So it's like any type of interviewing, whether it's in person or remote. Structured interviews where everybody that's involved in the organization, that's involved in the interview, has bought in and really built out that rubric to identify all the skills, not just the soft skills, but all the skills, and measure them and weigh them and report them back accordingly and appropriately. That's about as quickly as I can say it.
100% agree. That was going to be my answer, was structure.
Me too. Yep.
Perfect, because then that'll bring us right to the end here. So, to the audience, if anybody has any other questions, we'll be sending out follow-ups. And, if you have any other questions, we can definitely redirect those to the audience. We'll also include everyone's Twitter handles and things like that. So you can stay connected after the event. But I want to say thank you to Matt and Greg and Laurel. Thanks for taking the time. I think this is a really good conversation, and definitely a lot of good points were highlighted here. So thank you all for coming here and joining us, and thanks to the audience. Getting a lot of good responses here about how insightful and helpful this was already. So again, we'll be sending out some follow-ups and include everyone's Twitter handles or preferred method of follow-up. And I want to say, to everyone out there to stay safe and enjoy the rest of your week. And, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
All right. Thank you.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And that's it for another episode of Outside the Valley, brought to you by ARC. We created this podcast with the hope that in each episode, you can learn something new from other remote startup people. So if you have any feedback or suggestions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me at jovian@arc.dev. It's jovian@arc.dev. Or you can find us on Twitter at arc.dev. See you next week with another episode of Outside the Valley, and ciao.